It seems to me that it was just a minute ago that we began. Always seems that way. I'm very fortunate in the fact that eventually I will get all the papers and I will read them and I will go back and forth, and then eventually everybody will get them. The next presentation by Gary Gilbert, Claremont McKenna College. Jewish engagement in the urban life of the Roman world. Thank you.
Congratulations to everybody for making it through. So let me begin, as many others have already done, and that is to thank Leonard and the many individuals and institutions who have contributed both logistically and financially to this wonderful symposium. And let me also take this time that I have also to thank all of you, all of the speakers who have so wonderfully presented here. Myself, I have learned an incredible amount over these past 2 days about Jewish communities in Kiev, Cluj, and Kaunas, and Venice, and Prague, and Cleveland, and Muskogee, and many, many other locations. And I hope that my own presentation here today can somewhat repay your efforts. But at the same time, I would be remiss not to mention that being from California and Jewish studies being what it is sometimes, and speaking of institutional biases, I just want to remind everybody that there are Jews living west of the Rocky Mountains. You should come visit us. So as the final speaker at the symposium, I stand before you as the person who stands between you and home. So let's begin. And I'm going to follow Anthony and Teddy and be very low tech. I have no PowerPoint presentation. I have no handout for you. Most of what I'm going to be presenting here today involves terms and titles, not places or beautiful objects, as we have just seen. And so I have decided to forego what I thought to be unnecessary technological aids. So in my presentation, I too want to take you back to the time of the Roman Empire. Maybe not the Roman Empire of Mel Brooks, but nonetheless, the Roman Empire as it is presented to us in other ways. So without any PowerPoint, without any handouts, I invite you to sit back, relax, maybe rest your eyes, and we'll get you home shortly. So, writing in the early 2nd century CE, the Roman historian Tacitus, who I'm guessing probably would not care terribly much for the way Mel Brooks presents the Roman Empire, but be that as it may. Tacitus sets pen to parchment to chronicle the history of the early empire. Along the way, he recounts the events of the first Jewish revolt against Rome. Book 5 of his histories begins at the point where the Roman general and later Emperor Titus has pitched his camp outside the walls of Jerusalem. In order so that his Roman readers might gain a better appreciation of the people that are about to be conquered, Tacitus embarks upon a lengthy digression in which he presents various views of the origin of the Jewish people, their rights and customs, the topography of their land, and finally a brief primer on the political history of Judea, starting with the Macedonian conquest down to the outbreak of the war and the initial Roman success under the leadership of Vespasian. Following this review, the author returns to the narrative of the battle itself, noting in particular the robust defensive features of the city, the composition of the rebel forces, and a series of prodigies that foretold the doom of the Jewish people. The writing of Tacitus is not only provides us with invaluable information about the revolt, but also presents the most sustained, surviving presentation about Jews proffered by a non-Jewish author. Within the digression on Jewish rights and customs, Tacitus notes the following. The Jews are extremely loyal toward one another and always ready to show compassion. But toward every other people, they feel only hate and enmity. They sit apart at their meals and they sleep apart. they adopted circumcision to distinguish themselves from other people by this difference. Now, Tacitus was hardly alone in his presentation of Jews as prone to separation, clannishness, and even somewhat chauvinism. Early in the 1st century BCE, the rhetorician Apollonius Molon is said to have lambasted the Jews for declining to associate with those who have chosen to adopt a different mode of life. Philostratus, writing in the 3rd century CE, describes a speech delivered before Vespasian, supposedly a speech before Vespasian, in which the philosopher Euphrastes rebukes the man soon to be emperor for not using his resources at his disposal to overthrow the Emperor Nero, right? And maybe with good reason, but rather squandering his military forces to fight against the Jews who, quote, cut themselves off long ago, not only from the Romans, but from all humankind, a people who have devised an unsociable way of life, with no meals, libations, prayers, or sacrifices in common with others. Finally, writing around the same time, Cassius Dio describes the Jews as distinguished from the rest of humankind in practically every detail of life, and especially by the fact that they do not honor any of the usual gods. Now, lest it be thought that these perspectives are the product of ignorance, or one might even say anti-Semitism, although that might be a little anachronistic, Jewish writers as well, it should be noted, also offered similar estimations. So in the 2nd century BCE, the Jewish author of the letter of Aristeas from that grand city of Alexandria can write the following. The legislator, that is, he's referring to Moses here, surrounded us with unbroken palisades and iron walls to prevent our mixing with any of the other people in any manner. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish man whose thinking is steeped in Greek philosophy, expands on the words of the Moabite prophet Balaam and writes that in virtue of their distinction of their particular customs, Jews do not mix with others to depart from the ways of their fathers. And even Josephus, the Jewish historian and contemporary of Tacitus, rather than denying Molon's accusations that I've mentioned above, actually celebrates Jewish exclusivity by noting that the practice of self-isolation, it just happens to be common to all peoples and shared not only by Greeks, but by Greeks of the biggest reputation. So the casual, and even, I would say in many cases, even committed reader of these literary texts could justifiably come away with the impression that Jews in antiquity assiduously kept apart from Gentile society and willingly refrained from participation in the civic life of the places where they lived. So in this paper, what I want to do is to try to demonstrate essentially the opposite, and to show that Jewish life in antiquity, particularly in urban environments, was far more complex, and that Tacitus, Molon, and all the rest notwithstanding, included active engagements of Jews in civic life. So what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to speak briefly about various forms of civic engagement. And then I want to focus on one specific example that is of interest to me. And this comes from the ancient Anatolian city of Aphrodisias. So while the literary record, such as in Tacitus and others, depicts Jews as oftentimes being detached, misanthropic, other materials, particularly inscriptions, offer a strikingly different perspective. The vast corpus of information that I'm going to be reviewing is strewn across the Mediterranean, often the result of chance survival and also serendipitous discovery. More often than not, we know very little about the persons who are mentioned in these inscriptions. We know nothing about their lives or the contexts in which they lived. And in some cases, we can't even be absolutely sure that the persons mentioned in these sources were actually Jews, but that's a question for another day. A longer paper than I have time for today would address many of these methodological issues, but for now, I will just assert that we can observe a wide variety of activities over time and geographic location, which, when taken in the aggregate, I think offer a valuable picture of Jewish engagement in civic life in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, roughly 100 BCE to 400 CE. Now, I should also mention that my focus today, unlike Stephen Fine's, is specifically on Jewish life in diaspora communities, right? Not from the land of Israel. And now, this is not to say, I want to be clear, this is not to say that Jews living in Roman Palestine did not participate in civic life as well. They certainly did. The famous story from the Mishnah about Rabban Gamliel visiting the bathhouse of Akko, I think is but one example. But for now, I'm going to restrict almost all my comments to Jewish life in the diaspora. So a much larger study of this topic would want to examine Jews who participated in a variety of public spaces, including on the battlefield, in theaters, and other entertainment venues, as spectators, supporters, and performers, or in the gymnasium, the institution where young men were prepared for the demands of civic life. We'd also might benefit from a discussion of Jews who engaged in some fashion or another, sometimes it's not exactly clear, with various types of pagan religious practices and institutions, such as invoking the names of pagan deities or donating funds to festivals and sanctuaries. While each one of these forms of civic engagement deserves attention, I will focus today on those forms of engagement where Jews made actual or perhaps presumed contributions to the lives of the cities in which they lived. So let's talk a little bit about Jewish involvement in civic life. Numerous sources that record instances where Jews served as civic or imperial officials, and in so doing contributed to the functioning of the cities and empire. We possess a few examples of this type of activity already in the Hellenistic and early imperial periods. Papyri, supplemented by a few literary references, reveal Jews who functioned as tax officials, police officers, secretaries, and possibly also advisors to the Ptolemaic kings, all positions that were part of the state apparatus. In the later Ptolemaic period, one Onias served as the secretary or scribe in the royal court. In the major urban site of Alexandria, two wealthy and notable Jews, Alexander, the brother of the famous philosopher Philo, and Demetrius served as alabarchs, or customs superintendent, while other Jews also served as river guardians. In Cyrene, a city in North Africa, Eleazar, the son of Jason, was one of the city's nomophylaces, and thus was responsible for the recording and the proper administration of the laws of the city. As we move into the 3rd century and later, the recorded instances of Jews who assumed civic posts increases significantly. The larger number of references may be due in part to what is known as the epigraphic habit that characterized the Roman Empire of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But I think it's more than just chance survival. It's just more than people were just writing more inscriptions at the time. But I think it also likely reflects a change in Jewish life of the period. Around the year 200, getting back to the Codex Theodosianus, around the year 200, the Roman government expressly now permits Jews to enter into municipal offices and also undertake public service, oftentimes known as liturgies, specifically and explicitly without having to transgress their religion. Now, it is this latter privilege that was critical, since serving in an official post in a city often involved participation in local religious traditions, including rituals associated with pagan cults. Jews, particularly those living in urban sites of Asia Minor, took advantage of these opportunities to climb through the ranks of municipal service to become municipal magistrates and even patrons of their cities. By the middle of the 3rd century, we begin to find Jews serving in a variety of municipal and also, although to a lesser extent, imperial positions. In the mid-3rd century CE, a Jew served as the praepositatus stationis, an official in charge of a customs post in the European province of Pannonia. Jews served as an artiatros. We've talked about Jews as physicians before. And here is a case, even in antiquity, where Jews were the official municipal doctors in the 2nd century. One example from the 2nd century in the Anatolian city of Ephesus, another example from the 5th century in the southern Italian town of Venosa. In the late 4th or early 5th centuries, 2 Jews of Sidé in the south central region of Asia Minor, known as Pamphylia, held the post of Zugostates, and so were responsible for ensuring the value of the coinage there. In the grand city of Sardis, a Jew served as an assistant in the record office. And in the first half of the 3rd century, 2 persons from Achaemonia in the Phrygian region of Asia Minor, Aurelius Frugianus and Tiberius Flavius Alexander, also assumed various magistracies, including the oversight of the market, supervision of the grain supply, and as civic administrator. And these specific titles that were held by these 2 individuals placed them amongst the very elite members of the city. Finally, we find Jews serving as leading officials in their respective cities. We have examples from several cities, particularly in Asia Minor, and most particularly in the city of Sardis, where at least 9 persons, 9 Jews, who donated substantial funds to the synagogue, also served as city councilors in the city. In the southern Italian city of Venosa, several Jews were identified as father or patron of the city. The latter honorary title, one of the highest orders designating one of the most prominent notables in that particular city or community. In many instances, the Jews who held key municipal positions were also leaders within the Jewish community, right? That this is not some kind of binary that either you participate in the Jewish community or you participate in the civic community. Oftentimes, these 2 responsibilities went hand in hand. So I just mentioned the 9 Jews from Sardis who were active members of the synagogue and active members of the city council. Elsewhere, a Jewish man from North Africa who was described as father of the synagogue, was also a leading citizen of his city. And the connection between communal and civic engagement can be witnessed from 2 Jews, this is from a literary text, 2 Jews from the town of Modona on the island of Minorca. Both men, Theodorus and Cacilianus, were not only leaders of the Jewish community, but also served as the patronus of their town. And in addition, the Theodorus from this city also served as a defensor, that is a position established during, not too long before his time, to protect the weak from ruinously expensive and protracted litigation against the outrages of the powerful. So Jews assumed important positions, not only in municipal offices, such as I've been reviewing here, but also in imperial offices. And here and now I will expand my scope to include a few examples of Jews living in Roman Palestine as well. Elite and often well-connected Jews attained equestrian and senatorial status. Examples of actual posts rather than honorary titles, we find a Jew of Sardis who served as the assistant in the imperial archives. A few Jews are known to have held the position of comes and also palatinos, titles designating important positions in the imperial court and in the provincial administration of the late empire. Jews who held the title of comes appear in Sardis and also locations in the land of Israel, such as Haifa, Hamat Gader, and possibly also in Sepphoris. 2 Jews held the title of palatinos, one buried in the catacombs of Beit Sharin, and secondly, a man by the name of Theodotus, a member of the Jewish community of Aphrodisias that I will turn to in just a moment. Jews were also appointed as the prefect or procurator of the procurator, the chief provincial, or the chief procurator who were the chief provincial administrators. Right? Certainly the most famous Jew, let me start there again, that was it. Jews may have also been appointed as prefect or procurator, the chief provincial administrator. The most famous example of a Jew to rise to this office was certainly Tiberius Julius Alexander, who served as prefect of both Judea and Egypt. Although whether or not we should, or whether or not he was in his own time, or whether or not he himself still considered himself to be associated with the Jewish community, is a bit open to question. He certainly was born into a Jewish family, that much we know. In one last example, one of the donors to the Sardis inscription served as the ex-procurator, which could possibly be a reference to an actual office, but could also be an honorary title. Okay, by now you get the idea. Far, far from being loyal only towards one another or declining to associate with those unlike themselves, Jews actively and frequently engaged with many aspects of civic life, and moreover, contributed significantly to the well-being of their communities. So in the time remaining, I wish to focus on one particular urban Jewish community and examine how its activities may provide yet another example of how Jews engaged in civic life. The example I've chosen for today comes from the ancient city of Aphrodisias, located in Western Asia Minor, one of the best documented sites of Jewish life in this region. The city's history goes back at least to the Hellenistic period, but the city grew in great prominence during the Roman period. We don't know when Jews first came to Aphrodisias, although this particular region of Asia Minor had been the home of Jews from at least the 2nd century BCE. In 1976, as often happens, while preparing the ground for a new museum, archaeologists came upon a tall, rectangular stone, almost 3 meters in height. The texts, all written in Greek, appear on 2 sides of the stone. On one side, a group referring to itself as the Decania records the funding of a monument. Most of the 18 persons that are listed in this inscription bear recognizable Jewish names, such as Yael, the leader of the organization, Samuel, Benjamin, Judah. 3 of the members are explicitly identified as a proselytos, a proselyte or convert. 2 other individuals are described as theosebes, a term that is often translated as God-fearer, and I'll have more to say on that term in just a minute. The other side of this same stone consists of 2 lists of names. In the upper portion, the names are mostly distinctively Jewish or names that we know to have been frequently used by Jews. So there's Manasseh and Judas, Jacob and Joseph, Benjamin and Reuben, and 5 men named Elsabatios. After a short break in the text, after a short break in the writing, the text presents now a second list of names, this time beginning with the words, and those who are theosebes, that same term that I just mentioned a minute ago, that is, those who are God-fearers. It then proceeds to record the names of 52 individuals, none of whom bears a biblical name, and only one who carries a name that was at all used by Jews. In other words, the 52 people listed in this section of the inscription are almost certainly non-Jews. And at the head of this list, are 9 men listed as city councilors. So it's not just a random set of 52 people, it's very important people in that community. Like many Jewish inscriptions from this period, the Aphrodisiac inscription is both fascinating and frustrating. Many things about this remarkable stone and its writing remain unknown or uncertain. When was it written? What is the relation between the texts on the 2 different sides of the stone? Where was the inscription displayed? For today, I'm going to focus on 3 questions. First, what did this organization do? Second, for whom did they do it? And third, and finally, why did so many non-Jews contribute or participate in the Jewish community in this fashion? So first, what did this Jewish group do? The first side of the inscription refers to the activity of the Jewish group as providing relief from suffering. Now, the text does not explain what type of suffering was involved or how the Jewish community addressed the suffering, but there are a few hints in both the text and I think also in the broader context of the city that suggest that the Jewish organization provided some form of food relief. Their activity may have been motivated both by Jewish traditions, which express concern for the poor, but also local conditions. The Jewish propensity for providing food relief was apparently sufficiently widespread enough to prompt the Roman Emperor Julian in the 4th century to comment that no Jew ever has to beg for food. So I move to the second question. Who are the beneficiaries of this alimentary program? Once again, the laconic nature of the inscription offers us only hints, but little more. It designates the aid recipients by the single Greek word plethos, which we might understand, as was understood by the original scholars who published the inscription, as a reference to the Jewish community. And if they are correct, then what we have here is an example of essentially Jews assisting other Jews. Now, my argument here is overly technical, and I will admit right up front, not entirely conclusive, but I will assert that what I believe is that this term plethos refers not to the Jewish community, but to the broader civic community of Aphrodisias. So what we have here is a city where there are Jews and Gentiles who are contributing to the administration, and I would even say probably the funding of this charitable organization. So this is an inscription where we witness a Jewish organization essentially engaging in the civic life of a community by providing food relief to the people of that community, both Jewish and non-Jewish. Finally, why did a significant number of non-Jews join in common cause with the Jewish community? And again, the inscription thwarts any clear answer. Such is the case in part because we cannot be sure how long the list of non-Jewish, because we don't know exactly the relationship between these two sides of the stone, and we don't know the exact role that these 52 non-Jewish actors played in the Jewish organization. But leaving that aside, I believe that the two sides of the inscription are indeed related. But let's just focus on the first inscription that I mentioned. So among the 18 persons who donated from their own resources, they proudly declare, who donated, two of the 18 are designated as theosebes. That is the Greek term that is conventionally translated as God-fearing. And this is the same term that is also used on the other side of the inscription to designate the non-Jews who were being recognized alongside members of the Jewish community. So this is one reason why I believe that the two sides are related, but it's really the specific term. It's not only the specific term, but it's also the fact that both men, Elmonius and Antoninus, bear remarkably non-Jewish names. That renders it quite likely that these two individuals who participated in the activity of the Decaneia, who provided relief, and probably in the form of food relief, to the members, to the citizens of Aphrodisias, that these two individuals were not Jews. If we go further and connect both sides of the inscription together, what we essentially have is over 100 persons, Jews and non-Jews alike, who joined in this effort. So why would two, and possibly many, many more non-Jews participate in this food relief scheme? We can only imagine, but I would propose that a likely answer might be because by joining the Jewish organization, Jews and non-Jews were joining together in a very typical form of benefaction known throughout the Roman world. And that the non-Jewish residents of Aphrodisias were supporting this Jewish organization in its efforts to assist the citizens of the city. And while it is true that the Jews in Aphrodisias used their biblical names quite often as a means of identity and separation, they just as readily used their Eucharistic program as a means of solidarity and participation in the city that they called home. We know that it was not uncommon for organizations, and not necessarily Jewish organizations, but just general private organizations in cities of the Roman Empire, such as the Decaneia, to provide for the public welfare of their cities. So let me just cite a few examples of these private organizations serving a public function from various cities of Asia Minor, close to Aphrodisias. An association of tailors in the Lydian city of Thyatira paid for the construction of the city's gates and porticos, while the silversmiths in Smyrna repaired the statue of Athena. In a vein more befitting an act of charity, a college of purple dyers from Hierapolis in Phrygia established a program to aid poor children. Another society, this one from the northern Anatolian province of Pontus, appears to have acted at times to support the indigent, not unlike what was going on in Aphrodisias. In other words, private associations, not terribly dissimilar from what was going on in Aphrodisias, had a history in Asia Minor of developing and funding civically minded programs. And I am arguing here that this is essentially what this Jewish organization, the Decania, was doing. So in the few minutes I have remaining, let me describe what I think are some of the implications of this study. First, the materials reviewed here at the very least complicate, if not dispel, the standard literary presentation of Jews in the Roman world as aloof, prone to separation, and even misanthropic. Now, this is not to say that Jews did not embrace ideas, activities, other social forms that were particular to the Jewish community. Jews built synagogues. Jews regularly employed the symbol of the menorah on communal buildings and on everyday objects. Jews, with some exceptions, maybe, refrained from the worship of civic deities. At the same time, many of these same Jews also engaged themselves in significant ways in the life of the cities in which they lived. They sat next to non-Jews in the theater. They were schooled alongside non-Jews in the gymnasium, and they served alongside non-Jews in the city councils. The second implication, and that this information raises questions about the nature of Jewish identity in the Roman Empire. Most discussions of Jewish identity at this time tend to focus on the particularities of Jewish life. Jews practice circumcision. Jews observe Shabbat. Jews refrain from eating pork. And when discussions do mention activities outside the Jewish community, they often couch these presentations in the language of assimilation or acculturation. But I think the examples reviewed here suggest that something else may be going on, and that the involvement of civic life was no less, at least not significantly less, important to the Jews than how they lived their lives. So rather than trying to understand Jewish identity as one pitting resistance versus assimilation or reciprocity versus solidarity, I think we would better serve to think of Jews performing a type of cultural hybridity in which Jews maintained a sense of cultural integration as well as the movement to become an integral part of the larger societal framework. This study of Jewish life in the Roman Empire reinforces conclusions of Eric Gruen in his study of Jewish life from a slightly earlier period. There, he remarked, Jews strove to engender circumstances that would enable them to maintain their ancient heritage while engaging comfortably and productively in the lands of the classical world wherein they dwelled. I would only add that this is an apt description of Jewish life in the first century. It is even more so applies to Jews in later centuries. And while scholarly discussion of Jews in the ancient world regularly speak about religious competition, which is fair, I think the examples reviewed here depict Jews with a strong sense of self-identity as Jews, engaging in what might be described as religious or perhaps better civic cooperation. So third and finally, this information invites us to reconsider the historiography of this period of Jewish life. Many modern treatments of Jews and Judaism from this period acknowledge the influence of non-Jewish culture and the assimilatory practices of many Jews, yet at the same time often give little attention to this type of Jewish engagement in civic life. Rather, descriptions of Jews in the ancient world tend to focus on the more distinctive practices, beliefs, institutions that characterize Jewish life. So let me just give a couple examples. In perhaps one of the most kind of standard comprehensive reviews of Jewish life, that is the revised version of a much earlier German book, Emil Schur's The History of the Jewish People in the Age of Jesus Christ, that this particular volume devotes 80 pages to the priesthood and temple worship, 75 pages to Torah scholarship, 30 pages to the synagogue, 20 pages to the Sabbath and other rituals. But when it comes to discussing the relations between Jews and non-Jews, and specifically the involvement of Jews in the social, cultural, and political life of the ancient city, the work devotes a grand total of 7 pages. We can look at other volumes of other contemporary volumes, such as Jean Justet's Die Juifs dans l'Empire Romain, who devotes far, far more attention to Jewish involvement in civic life. And I think there's several factors for that. But even with Justet's monumental work, I think it is still the case that much of the historiography and Jewish life in this period tends to marginalize this type of Jewish involvement. And I'll give just one more example. In the 2 volumes of the more recent than Schur, in the 2 volumes of the Cambridge History of Judaism devoted to the Roman period, this is volumes 3 and 4, there are numerous entries on subjects such as the Pharisees, Galilean Judaism, Josephus and Philo, festivals, prayer, and many other recognizably Jewish topics. And while it is true there are entries on Jewish inscriptions and the diaspora, there is no separate entry on Jewish involvement in civic life. And I think that that's a mistake. And I believe, not only is it a mistake, but I also believe that the memory of the Jews of Aphrodisias and elsewhere in the diaspora call upon us to do better. Because if we don't, Tacitus wins. Thank you very much. Please?
Yeah. Thank you for this presentation. This reminds me the question whether, to what extent Jews were engaged in the general society in 17th and 18th century Europe. And your examples resemble, for me at least, those figures known as the court Jews. Now, I'm very well aware of the scarcity of sources in the period which you are dealing with. Still, my question is, to what extent, the common Jews, if I can call them this way, were engaged or involved in the city's life?
Right. So, a couple comments. The first comment is, as you correctly point out, this whole issue of court Jews, Jews becoming involved in civic life, what happens after emancipation, right? This is a topic that is common to modern Jewish historians. I mean, this is something modern Jewish historians talk about all the time, right? Historians of ancient Jewish life don't talk about it that much. And I think we who study ancient Jewish life, we have a lot to learn from modernists. So I thank you for that. So yeah, the whole kind of example, the practice of of the court Jew, right? The specific Jewish individual who was identified by the ruler of the city, the state, whatever, because of his intellect, because of his connections, because of whatever. I don't think that's what's happening here. I mean, there might be some examples of that, particularly in imperial administration, but not in civic administration. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think that these are Jews who are, again, maybe somewhat, to use the term somewhat anachronistically, who are patriotic, right? Who feel connected, who feel a part of the cities in which they live and want to contribute to. Steve, please.
A long time ago, I stopped using the word diaspora.
Yes.
As in diaspora Judaism.
I don't. Okay. I don't think I used diaspora Judaism.
I know you didn't.
Okay.
I know. This isn't a frontal look.
Okay.
Why? Because for exactly the reasons you're describing. In other words, whenever I use the word diaspora, it's with a little d. Mm-hmm. And it's never diaspora Judaism. Right. It's right. Yeah. It's those Jews in those very local communities who have things that they share locally, and they have things that they share outside. And I don't think it's just an ancient Judaism issue. I think that the German Academy loves sectarianism as opposed to the Catholic Academy. And Jewish studies in this field, especially in this country, has been a Protestant endeavor. And so we've gone after, well, sects, because, right, and we even create them, we call them non-rabbinic Jews. And so the shared, as in almost all periods, gets lost unless you're an annal scholar to the picanti, to the weird, to the separatist. And it takes a real sort of person to read those annal people clearly to say, gee whiz, let's talk about the normal. And that's what you're talking about, is the normal, which I appreciate so much.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, this is a discussion for an entire conference, about how do we segment, how do we organize, categorize, really, right? I mean, this is all about categorization, right? What's the difference between, rabbinic Judaism, non-rabbinic Judaism, or diaspora, Palestinian Judaism, whatever. And I agree that, and I very intentionally did not use the term diaspora Judaism because I agree completely with you on that topic.
I knew that without you saying it, because you didn't use the term.
Yeah, I didn't use it. Right, exactly. Yeah, you caught that. That's very good. And I agree probably with 98% of what you said. I would just push back just a little bit. And just ask, are there some kind of distinctive differences? Can we notice some distinctive differences between Jews living in Roman Palestine versus Jews living outside of that region? Right?
Lots of them.
Lots of them.
That's not the point.
Okay.
I'm not saying everybody's. See, people always assume that that's me with my kippah, I'm trying to make everybody sort of similar. I'm just not you, but in general, that's an assumption about my writing, which is simply not true. It's about where do we put the emphasis, on difference or on similarity?
Right.
And we spend so much time putting it on difference that we've forgotten similarity, which is exactly Ed Sanders' response, right?
Yeah.
Which is Shia Goffney's response, which is how a whole group of reasonably moderate, which is Eric Meyer's response, right?
Yep.
Which is how a whole group of reasonably moderate people are looking at the hypersectarianization or the homogenization. And I think you fit into that.
No, and I don't think we disagree on that, because I mean I would take Ed Sanders' common Judaism, idea of common Judaism, and very much find that to be an incredibly valuable way to think about.
Let me give you an example. I just finished this article on the Sardis Synagogue, which is too long. It's going to go in the final report, and I used a lot of rabbinic sources. Not that they were talking to rabbis, not that they may not have heard of rabbis, but a God-fearer is a God-fearer, and how do those people deal with them, and how do those people deal with them, right? In other words, phenomenologically or socially, how do two different groups deal with it? Now, people jump immediately when they do that and say, see, he's rabbinizing, when the reality is what I'm doing is using real sources.